The people who laugh the loudest at you are often the ones least prepared to discover your name. If someone had told me that one ordinary Friday would split my life into a before and an after, I would have laughed along with everyone else. At exactly 6:40 p.m., I stood in the marble ballroom of the Hawthorne Grand Hotel, wearing a navy suit that had been tailored 3 years ago and polished shoes that had seen better days. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across the room. String music drifted through conversations worth millions of dollars, and waiters glided past carrying sparkling water and tiny appetizers that looked too perfect to eat. I adjusted the name badge hanging from my jacket and reminded myself to breathe. My job was simple. Smile. Deliver the presentation files. Stay invisible. That plan lasted less than 5 minutes. "Excuse me," a sharp voice called from behind. I turned to see a woman in an emerald evening gown looking me up and down as if I had accidentally wandered into the wrong movie. The catering staff enters through the service hallway. A few nearby guests chuckled politely. "Actually," I answered with the calmest smile I could manage, "I'm here for the executive summit." Her perfectly shaped eyebrow lifted. "Really?" Before I could explain, another voice joined in. "Then where's your invitation?" The question came from a tall man with neatly combed dark hair and the effortless confidence that only old money seemed to produce. Adrian Cole. Everyone in the city knew his face. His family's investment company had funded half the skyline outside the ballroom windows. He wasn't cruel when he asked. If anything, he sounded genuinely puzzled. That somehow made it sting even more. I reached into my pocket, only to discover it was empty. My invitation card had slipped out somewhere between the valet stand and the registration desk. I searched every pocket twice before looking back up. I must have dropped it. Someone laughed. Another guest whispered loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Convenient. The circle around us grew larger. Phones stayed tucked away, but curious eyes never looked elsewhere. A man wearing an expensive watch folded his arms. Security should probably check this out. Adrian studied me for another moment. His blue eyes weren't mocking, but they weren't defending me either. He simply watched, weighing facts he didn't have. That silence hurt more than open criticism. I wanted to explain. I wanted to tell them they were making a mistake. Instead, I straightened my shoulders. My father had always said that dignity wasn't something people could hand you or take away. It was something you carried yourself, especially when no one else believed you deserved it. 2 security officers approached with practiced professionalism. "Sir," one of them said gently, "would you mind stepping outside while we verify your credentials?" Every conversation around us seemed to pause just long enough to witness my embarrassment. The music continued, glasses clinked together, and somewhere across the ballroom someone celebrated closing another impossible business deal. I nodded once. Of course. As I turned toward the exit, I caught Adrian watching me again. There was uncertainty in his expression now, just the faintest crack beneath the polished confidence. He looked as though he wanted to ask another question, but decided against it. Neither of us noticed the silver-haired gentleman entering through the grand doors at that exact moment. The instant his eyes found me across the ballroom, his composed expression changed completely. The cool evening air outside the hotel felt strangely quieter than the ballroom I had just left. The heavy glass doors closed behind me with a soft click, sealing away the laughter, the music, and the whispers that had followed me across the polished marble floor. One of the security officers offered an apologetic smile. "I am sorry about the misunderstanding, sir. We simply have to follow procedure." "I understand," I replied. And I did. They were only doing their jobs. The embarrassment came from somewhere else entirely. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket one more time, hoping my invitation might magically appear. Nothing. My wallet, my phone, a folded grocery receipt from 2 days ago, but not the envelope I had carefully packed that morning. Somewhere between the parking garage and the registration desk, it had vanished. I let out a quiet breath and glanced toward the city skyline. Hundreds of office windows reflected the fading orange sunset, each one glowing like another reminder that appearances often mattered more than truth. Behind me, the ballroom doors opened again. More guests arrived dressed in tailored tuxedos and designer gowns, each welcomed with warm smiles by the event staff. No one noticed the man standing alone beside the stone planter near the entrance. That was fine. I had spent years becoming invisible whenever necessary. My phone vibrated. The screen displayed a single message from an unknown number. Running 5 minutes late. Do not leave. No signature. No explanation. I slipped the phone back into my pocket without reacting. 5 minutes was not a long time. Inside the ballroom, the annual Hawthorne Leadership Award ceremony would begin soon. Every major investor in the state seemed to be attending. Television crews had already set up their cameras. Reporters stood near the entrance rehearsing introductions, while photographers adjusted their lenses beneath the hotel lights. The security officer beside me shifted awkwardly. If your invitation is confirmed, we will escort you back inside immediately. Thank you, I answered. His radio suddenly crackled with hurried voices that I could not quite understand. Both officers exchanged puzzled looks before one of them pressed a hand against his earpiece. Repeat that. His expression changed almost instantly. Respect replaced routine. Confusion replaced certainty. He looked toward the ballroom entrance, then back at me as if seeing an entirely different person. Before he could speak, another black sedan rolled beneath the front canopy. It was not flashy. There were no flags or police escorts. Still, every valet nearby straightened their posture the moment it stopped. An older gentleman stepped out wearing a charcoal overcoat despite the mild weather. Silver hair, calm eyes, perfect posture. Even from 50 feet away, people recognized him. Conversations near the entrance softened into murmurs. Richard Ashford rarely attended public events anymore. The retired founder of Ashford Holdings had built one of the largest private investment groups in the country before disappearing almost completely from public life. Most people only saw him in business magazines now. Richard did not acknowledge the reporters waiting by the entrance. He did not wave to investors eager for a handshake. Instead, his eyes searched the front steps with quiet purpose until they landed on me. For the briefest second, something almost fatherly crossed his face. Then he smiled. It was small, genuine, and completely unexpected. Every person standing nearby seemed to notice it at exactly the same moment. Richard Ashford walked toward me with the unhurried confidence of a man who had spent decades making decisions that moved entire industries. Every step seemed to pull the attention of the entrance with it. Reporters lowered their microphones. Valets stopped reaching for car doors. Even the security officers standing beside me straightened instinctively. I had not seen Richard in almost 8 months, yet his warm smile had not changed at all. "Ethan," he said, extending his hand as though greeting an old friend instead of someone waiting outside a ballroom. "I hope I did not keep you waiting too long." I shook his hand with an easy smile. "Only a few minutes." Richard chuckled softly. "Traffic has become my greatest rival." One of the security officers blinked several times before speaking. "Sir, do you know Mr. Brooks?" Richard turned toward him with polite surprise. "Know him?" His expression became almost amused. "I specifically asked for him to attend tonight." Silence settled over the entrance like fresh snow. Nobody moved. Nobody seemed willing to interrupt whatever had just happened. The officer immediately lowered his head. "Our apologies, sir. There was an issue with the invitation verification." Richard simply nodded. "These things happen." There was no anger in his voice. No accusation. Somehow that kindness made the misunderstanding feel even heavier. Behind the glass doors, several guests had begun watching from inside the lobby. I recognized the woman in the emerald gown who had mistaken me for catering staff. Her confident posture had disappeared. She whispered something to another guest while looking directly at Richard and then back at me. Across the marble floor stood Adrian Cole. He had clearly followed the commotion to the entrance. Even from a distance, I could see the uncertainty in his eyes growing stronger. He looked at Richard, then at me, then back again as though trying to solve a puzzle that no longer fit together. Richard rested a reassuring hand against my shoulder. "Come. There are people inside who have been looking forward to meeting you." Before I could answer, another familiar voice called from the entrance. "Mr. Ashford." A woman in her early 60s approached quickly with silver-framed glasses and a tablet tucked beneath her arm. "Linda Mercer." Richard's executive assistant for longer than most people could remember. She stopped beside us and offered me a respectful smile. "Good evening, Mr. Brooks. Everything has been prepared exactly as requested." I nodded. "Thank you, Linda." The security officers exchanged another confused glance. They clearly knew Linda. Everyone in the city's business community knew Linda Mercer. Yet she was speaking to me with the same professional respect she reserved for chief executives and board members. Richard accepted a folder from her before handing it directly to me without even opening it. I believe this belongs with you. I tucked the folder beneath my arm without looking inside. That small gesture seemed to create even more questions among the growing crowd. Adrian had stepped closer now, though he remained several feet away. Our eyes met for only a second. His expression no longer carried doubt or quiet judgment. Instead, it reflected genuine curiosity mixed with the uncomfortable realization that first impressions could be dangerously incomplete. Before anyone could ask another question, the ballroom lights dimmed behind the glass. A voice echoed through the grand speakers announcing that the evening's keynote presentation would begin in exactly 3 minutes. Richard smiled toward the entrance before glancing back at me. I believe it is finally time for everyone to meet you properly. The ballroom. Doors opened once again, but this time they did not feel like a barrier. Richard Ashford walked beside me as though there had never been any question about where I belonged. The conversations that had filled the room only minutes earlier faded into careful whispers. Crystal glasses paused halfway to smiling lips. Even the musicians seemed quieter beneath the glow of the chandeliers. I could almost feel hundreds of eyes trying to solve the same mystery. Who exactly was Ethan Brooks? Richard greeted familiar faces with effortless warmth, introducing me only by name and nothing more. That somehow made everyone even more curious. We passed the registration desk where the young employee who had searched unsuccessfully for my invitation looked completely overwhelmed. "I am so sorry, Mr. Brooks," she whispered as we walked by. I smiled gently. "You followed the information you had. There is nothing to apologize for." Relief softened her expression, but the people standing nearby noticed every word. Kindness had a way of traveling farther than anger. Across the ballroom, Adrian stood near one of the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Instead of joining another conversation, he watched Richard lead me toward the reserved seating section at the front of the room. When our paths finally crossed, he stepped forward before anyone else could. "Mr. Brooks," he said carefully, "I believe I owe you an apology for making assumptions earlier." His voice was calm and sincere, without excuses or rehearsed charm. I appreciated that more than he probably realized. "You only reacted to what you saw," I answered. "Most people would have done the same." Adrian studied my face for another second, as though hoping I might reveal something hidden between the lines. I have a feeling I did not see very much at all. Before I could respond, another executive hurried toward Richard carrying a tablet. His expression looked unusually tense. "Sir, we have a problem." Richard accepted the tablet and quietly reviewed several pages before handing it to me without a word. Charts, financial projections, and a list of investor commitments filled the screen. One number immediately caught my attention. A major funding partner had withdrawn less than an hour before the ceremony, leaving a gap large enough to threaten the entire expansion project that tonight's celebration was built around. The executives surrounding us exchanged nervous glances. One of them lowered his voice. "If we cannot secure a replacement before tomorrow morning, months of negotiations could collapse." Richard remained remarkably calm. "Has anyone contacted the Horizon Group?" The executive sighed. "We tried. They declined our meeting request 3 times this week." Another executive added, "Without Horizon, there is no realistic alternative." I listened quietly while the discussion continued around me. Nobody seemed to notice that I recognized every company listed in the report. Adrian glanced toward the tablet, then back at me. His curiosity deepened when he noticed Richard waiting instead of issuing instructions himself. It was subtle, but impossible to ignore. Richard was allowing me to read first, allowing me to think first. The room slowly filled with anxious conversations as news of the funding problem spread among the invited guests. The celebration that had begun with polished confidence now carried an undercurrent of uncertainty. I closed the tablet and handed it back to Richard with a small nod. "Do not cancel tomorrow's meeting," I said quietly. "There is still one conversation that has not happened yet." Richard's eyes brightened with unmistakable confidence. "That is exactly what I was hoping you would say." Standing only a few feet away, Adrian heard every word, and for the first time that evening, he looked at me with something far different than curiosity. He looked at me as though he had just realized I might be holding a piece of the future everyone else was desperately trying to find. The keynote presentation began beneath a wash of soft golden light. Yet the atmosphere inside the ballroom had shifted completely. Only 20 minutes earlier, the room had been filled with effortless confidence. Now uncertainty lingered beneath every conversation like an approaching storm. Executives checked their phones more often than they listened to the speaker. Investors exchanged cautious glances instead of optimistic smiles. Somewhere near the back of the room, a reporter quietly updated his notes after hearing whispers about the missing funding partner. Richard Ashford remained composed, but I knew him well enough to recognize the tiny details most people missed. The way he folded his hands a little tighter. The brief pause before answering simple questions. He trusted numbers, but tonight he was trusting something else. Timing. Adrian quietly stepped beside me while the audience applauded another speaker. "May I ask you something?" he said. "Of course." He hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Richard Ashford listens to very few people. I have known him for years, and I have never seen him hand sensitive financial reports to someone outside his executive board." I smiled faintly. "Perhaps he simply trusts me." Adrian let out a quiet laugh. "That is exactly what worries me. I cannot figure out why." Before I could answer, the master of ceremonies returned to the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, before tonight's leadership award is presented, we have one important announcement regarding tomorrow's Strategic Partnership Summit." The ballroom grew silent. Every executive in attendance understood what those words meant. The chairman of the organizing committee approached the microphone with visible tension. "As many of you know, one of our principal investment partners unexpectedly withdrew earlier today. We remain committed to tomorrow's discussions, and we are confident a solution will be found." Polite applause followed, but it sounded forced. Everyone knew replacing a multi-billion-dollar investment overnight bordered on impossible. One guest seated several rows ahead quietly muttered, "Without Horizon Group, the expansion is finished." Another replied, "Nobody gets Horizon to change its mind." Adrian heard the exchange as well. He folded his arms and looked toward the stage with concern. "They are right," he admitted. "Horizon has rejected every proposal for months." I kept my eyes on the speaker. "Not every proposal." Adrian turned toward me. "What do you mean?" Before I answered, Linda Mercer approached with her tablet. She leaned close enough that only Richard and I could hear. "Mr. Brooks, the board members have arrived earlier than expected. They are asking whether the private meeting should proceed before the award ceremony." Richard did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked directly at me. Around us, several executives noticed the exchange. One of them whispered to another, clearly confused by why Richard continued waiting for my opinion. I considered the schedule for only a moment. "Let them wait another 15 minutes, I said quietly. "If we meet now, emotions will control the conversation. If we meet after the next announcement, they will listen instead of argue." Richard smiled with unmistakable approval. "Excellent." Linda immediately updated the schedule without asking another question. Adrian watched the entire exchange in complete silence. Finally, he shook his head with a quiet smile that carried more curiosity than disbelief. "You speak as though those board members work for you." I looked toward the brightly lit stage where the chairman prepared to introduce the evening's final guest. "No," I answered softly. "But tomorrow morning, one decision I make will determine whether every person in this room celebrates or starts over from the beginning." The chairman adjusted his tie beneath the spotlight and smiled toward the audience, although the tension in his eyes betrayed the polished expression. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "before we conclude tonight's ceremony, we would like to recognize a remarkable partnership that has quietly shaped many of the initiatives celebrated in this room." A large screen behind the stage illuminated with photographs of community projects, technology incubators, scholarship programs, and small businesses that had grown into national companies. Many guests nodded with admiration, but few seemed to notice one unusual detail. None of the projects displayed the name of a sponsoring corporation. The chairman continued, "For nearly 7 years, these programs have been supported by a private investment office that has intentionally remained anonymous." Curious whispers rippled across the ballroom. Anonymous donors existed, but not on this scale. Adrian leaned slightly closer to me without taking his eyes off the screen. "Do you know who they are?" I answered honestly, "Yes." Before he could ask another question, Richard Ashford quietly stepped onto the stage. The applause that greeted him filled the ballroom within seconds. He accepted the microphone with his familiar calm and waited until the room became silent again. Most people believe leadership begins with recognition, he said. I have learned the opposite. The strongest leaders often build opportunities without asking for applause. He paused, letting the words settle. Several years ago, I met someone who challenged nearly every assumption I had about business, service, and success. Someone who insisted that the greatest investment is not measured by quarterly reports, but by the lives improved after everyone has forgotten your name. The audience listened with complete attention. Richard smiled faintly. Many of you have spent years trying to identify the founder of Horizon Private Capital. The room froze. Even the waitstaff seemed to stop moving. Horizon Private Capital. The same organization every executive had spent months trying to reach. The same investment group that had quietly transformed regional industries while refusing interviews, publicity, and award ceremonies. Richard looked directly toward where I was standing. Tonight, I believe that anonymity has served its purpose. Hundreds of heads turned at once. I could almost hear the collective breath disappear from the ballroom. Adrian slowly followed everyone's gaze until his eyes met mine. Confusion flashed across his face, followed by disbelief. Richard extended his hand toward me. Ethan, would you join me? Every step toward the stage felt strangely peaceful. Nobody whispered anymore. Nobody laughed. The silence carried an entirely different weight than it had earlier that evening. I accepted the microphone only after shaking Richard's hand. Looking across the ballroom, I recognized the woman who had mistaken me for catering staff. She lowered her eyes almost immediately. Several executives who had barely acknowledged my existence now stared as though they were seeing a stranger. Adrian remained completely still near the front row. He was not shocked because I was wealthy. He was shocked because every conversation we had shared over the past hour suddenly carried an entirely different meaning. I looked across the audience and smiled gently. Good evening. My name is Ethan Brooks. Although many of you know Horizon Private Capital, very few of you know me. That has always been intentional. I have found that people reveal their true character when they believe there is nothing to gain from the person standing in front of them. Tonight has reminded me that lesson is still true. No one interrupted. No one looked away. Somewhere in the front row, Adrian lowered his head for just a moment, and I could see the realization settle across his face as he finally understood that the quiet man everyone had overlooked was the one person capable of changing everything that would happen tomorrow. When the applause finally began, it did not explode all at once. It spread slowly through the ballroom, hesitant at first, as though everyone needed a few extra seconds to rearrange everything they thought they knew. Then the room erupted into a standing ovation. I thanked them with a small nod before returning the microphone to Richard Ashford. Recognition had never been the reason I built Horizon Private Capital, and I had no desire to make the evening about myself. As the ceremony resumed, people who had ignored me less than an hour earlier suddenly found urgent reasons to introduce themselves. Business cards appeared from expensive suit pockets. Invitations to private dinners arrived before the dessert course. Executives who had barely acknowledged my existence now praised my vision, my leadership, and my generosity as though they had admired me for years. The change was almost surreal. Yet the compliments themselves did not interest me. What fascinated me was how quickly perception could change once people attached value to a name. Near one of the tall windows overlooking the city, I noticed the woman in the emerald gown approaching slowly. Gone was the confident smile she had worn earlier. She stopped a respectful distance away and folded her hands together. Mr. Brooks, she said quietly, I owe you an apology. I judged you before giving you the chance to speak. That was unfair, and I regret it. I smiled gently. Thank you for saying that. We all make quick judgments sometimes. What matters is whether we learn from them. Relief softened her expression, and after thanking me again, she quietly returned to her table. A few minutes later, another executive approached to apologize for suggesting security remove me from the ballroom. Then another. None of them sounded dishonest. If anything, they appeared genuinely embarrassed. Still, I realized something important. Forgiveness did not erase first impressions. It simply prevented them from becoming permanent. Adrian remained the only person who had not approached me. Instead, he stood alone near the balcony doors, looking out across the skyline where thousands of office lights shimmered beneath the evening sky. There was no phone in his hand, no conversation, just quiet reflection. I stepped beside him without saying anything at first. The city stretched before us in shades of silver and gold. After a long silence, Adrian spoke. I have negotiated billion-dollar contracts without losing my composure. He let out a soft laugh. Yet I cannot seem to find the right words tonight. I rested my hands lightly on the balcony railing. Sometimes there are no perfect words. He nodded slowly. Earlier this evening, I watched people question whether you even belonged in this building. I did not join them, but I also did nothing to stop it. His voice carried no excuses, only honesty. I keep replaying that moment in my head. I looked toward the ballroom, where laughter had cautiously begun returning. You asked for my invitation. You did not insult me. Adrian shook his head. That is not enough. I saw someone standing alone, and instead of offering trust, I offered doubt. The sincerity in his voice was impossible to miss. It was not guilt over my wealth or influence. It was disappointment in himself. For the first time that evening, I understood why Richard had always spoken so highly of Adrian Cole. Character revealed itself most clearly. After a mistake, not before it. Adrian finally turned to face me. Whether we ever work together or not, I hope someday you will allow me the opportunity to earn a better first impression than the one I gave you tonight. Adrian's words lingered between us long after the music inside the ballroom rose again. There was something unexpectedly comforting about his honesty. In my experience, people rarely admitted when they had been wrong, especially those who had spent their lives surrounded by influence and success. They preferred polished explanations over uncomfortable truth. Adrian had chosen the truth. I smiled. A first impression is only the first chapter. It does not have to become the whole story. The tension in his shoulders eased just enough for me to notice. Does that mean I still have a chance to rewrite mine? He asked with a quiet laugh. That depends on what you do next, I replied. Before either of us could say more, Richard Ashford stepped onto the balcony, carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water. I thought I might find you both here, he said, handing 1 glass to each of us. He looked toward the skyline with the satisfied expression of someone watching years of careful planning finally unfold. The board meeting has been moved to 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, he said. Every director will attend. I nodded. Good. That gives everyone enough time to think instead of react. Richard smiled knowingly. Exactly. Adrian looked from Richard to me before asking the question that had clearly been on his mind all evening. If you do not mind me asking, why keep your identity hidden for so many years? Most people in your position would have welcomed the attention. I looked across the city lights stretching toward the horizon. Because money changes conversations before they even begin. I wanted to understand people before they understood my balance sheet. Richard quietly chuckled. That answer has frustrated journalists for years. I continued. When people believe you have nothing to offer them, they become remarkably honest. Some become kind without expecting anything in return. Others reveal ambitions they would normally disguise. Those moments teach you far more than any financial report ever could. Adrian nodded slowly as though every sentence was reshaping something inside him. Then tonight became another lesson. For all of us, I answered. Back inside the ballroom, the award ceremony concluded with renewed optimism. News of my identity had spread throughout the room, but something else had changed as well. The conversation was no longer centered on my wealth. Instead, guests spoke about the scholarships Horizon had funded, the neighborhoods it had revitalized, and the entrepreneurs whose companies had survived because someone had quietly believed in them. That mattered infinitely more than headlines. As the evening came to an end, Richard excused himself to meet several board members. Adrian and I walked together toward the hotel entrance where the cool night air greeted us once again. The same marble steps where I had stood alone only hours earlier now felt completely different. A black sedan waited nearby, but neither of us hurried toward it. Adrian slipped a simple business card from his jacket and offered it to me. Not for business, he said before I could refuse. My direct number. If you ever decide you would like coffee without boardrooms, investors, or formal introductions, I would genuinely enjoy the conversation. I accepted the card with a small smile before reaching into my own wallet. Instead of handing him an executive contact, I gave him a plain white card with only my name, personal phone number, and email address printed neatly across the center. Adrian looked at it for a second before smiling back. I suppose this is my opportunity to earn Chapter 2. I believe everyone deserves that opportunity, I said, and for the first time that evening, Our handshake felt less like the beginning of a business relationship and more like the beginning of genuine trust. The board meeting began promptly at 8 o'clock the following morning inside a quiet conference room overlooking the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows welcomed the first rays of sunlight, painting the polished oak table in warm shades of gold. Around it sat some of the most influential leaders in the country, yet the mood was remarkably different from the previous evening. Pride had been replaced by humility. Assumptions had given way to careful listening. Richard Ashford opened the meeting with only a few brief remarks before inviting me to speak. I stood without presentation slides or rehearsed speeches. Partnerships are built on trust, I began. Not only trust in numbers, but trust in people. Yesterday reminded all of us how easily appearances can influence judgment. Today gives us the opportunity to choose differently. The room remained completely silent. I outlined Horizon Private Capital's proposal, not as a rescue package, but as a long-term partnership focused on sustainable growth, local businesses, education, and responsible investment. Questions followed, but they were thoughtful rather than defensive. One by one, the directors nodded in agreement. By the end of the meeting, every major concern had been resolved. The expansion project would move forward exactly as planned. Relief spread across the room, followed by genuine optimism. As everyone prepared to leave, the executive who had first suggested replacing the lost funding partner approached me quietly. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "thank you for giving us another chance after everything that happened yesterday." I smiled. People grow when they are willing to learn. That is worth investing in. Outside the conference room, Adrian waited near the windows with 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to me with a relaxed smile. No board members, no reporters, just coffee, exactly as promised. I accepted it with a grateful nod. We walked together through a nearby park where early morning joggers passed beneath rows of maple trees and families pushed strollers along quiet paths. The city suddenly felt much smaller without cameras and formal introductions. Adrian laughed as he admitted he had spent half the night reading every public report Horizon had ever released. "You know what surprised me most?" he asked. "It was never about making the biggest investment. It was always about making the right one. The numbers matter," I replied, "but people decide whether those numbers become something meaningful." He nodded thoughtfully before stopping beside a small pond where sunlight shimmered across the water. "I spent years believing success was measured by influence," he admitted. "Yesterday taught me that character leaves a much longer legacy." We stood there for a quiet moment, watching a group of children toss pieces of bread to a family of ducks. There was something peaceful about ordinary moments after extraordinary ones. Before we returned to work, Adrian extended his hand once more. This time it was not an apology, a business greeting, or a formal introduction. It was simply a promise. I shook it with an easy smile. Some relationships begin with admiration. Others begin with perfect timing. Ours began with a mistake that forced both of us to see beyond appearances. As I looked across the bright morning skyline, I realized the most valuable thing I had gained was never another successful investment or another completed deal. It was the reminder that dignity does not depend on recognition. Kindness is never wasted even when misunderstood, and the people who choose to see your character before your status are often the ones worth keeping in your life long after the applause has faded.